Hello, everyone. Welcome again to this week's online Parashah or Torah portion class. I'm Rabbi Ari Sachs of Congregation Beth Mordechai, and it is my honor to have you join us for this week's class. This week we're going to be learning about Parashat Mikeitz, one of the final Torah portions in the entire book of Genesis, focusing on the second third of this week's Torah portion as ordained by the conservative movement. This portion is a very famous one, as are many of the Torah portions in the entire book of Genesis. This one deals with the moment in which Joseph is given the power to be able to ration food for Egypt in order to be able to sustain the people over the course of the 7 years of famine that follow the 7 years of plenty. And he does such a good job with it, and this is from the earlier part of the Torah portion, does such a good job with it that there are nations from all over the world that come to Egypt and ask Joseph if they can receive some food. And that is where we're going to begin today in regards to how the people actually gain some of the food for their own nations. And so we're now going to turn to Sefaria.org. Genesis chapter 41. I'm sorry, 42. I apologize, it's 41. Beginning with verse 53. Vatichlena sheva shenei hasava asher haya be'eretz Mitzrayim. And the 7 years of plenty that was in the land of Egypt came to an end. Vatchilena sheva shnei hara'av. And so began the 7 years of famine. Lavo ka'asher amar Yosef. And they came just as Joseph had said. Vayhi ra'av bechol ha'aratzot. And this famine afflicted all of the lands. Uvechol eretz Mitzrayim haya lachem. But all of the land of Egypt had food. So we learn here that what makes the difference between Egypt and the rest of the land is that Egypt was able to have bread. They had this plan in place of Joseph being able to ration all the bread, and other nations did not do enough advanced preparation for this famine, and so they were starving. As such, Vatir av kol eretz Mitzrayim, and when all the land of Egypt was famished, Vayitzak ha'am el paro lalachem. And so the entire nation went to Pharaoh and said, "Can you give us bread?" Vayomer paro lechol Mitzrayim. And so Pharaoh said to all of Egypt, "Lechu el Yosef, go to Joseph, asher yomar lachem ta'asu, and do as he says for you to do. V'hara'av haya al kol penei haaretz." And as was already mentioned, that this famine existed upon the entire land, seemingly around all the other nations as near Egypt as well. Vayiftach Yosef et kol asher bahem, and he opened. Joseph opened all of the stores of the grain, and what did he do? Vayishbor lemitzrayim, and he sold unto the Egyptians. Vayechazak hara'av be'eretz Mitzrayim, and as such, the famine was very strong in the land of Egypt. And this should go one more. V'chol haaretz ba'u Mitzrayima, and all the other nations came to Egypt. Lishbor el Yosef, in order to buy this grain from Joseph. Ki chazak hara'av b'chol haaretz, because all of this grain was so strong because all this grain was present in Egypt, and yet they were all starving. So, what does that have to say? One of the most interesting aspects of this particular beginning of the story of how Joseph would give out the food to all of the other nations and to the Egyptians is the term vayishbor lachem, that he would sell, and people would buy the food from Joseph. That term lehashbir has the connotation of commerce, meaning that this is something that you buy and sell. And what's interesting is that if you go to Jerusalem, the very top of the Ben Yehuda, that area is called the Mashbir because it is a place in which many goods are sold. There's in fact one major store up there, the very top of Ben Yehuda. And as such, the idea of buying and selling is at the heart of what Joseph did to be able to not only make enough money for Egypt, just imagine how much money would come in at this time, but also to describe how Joseph would determine who actually receives the grains. In other words, that the very act of buying and selling here reflects the need at this particular moment to get grain, and also reflects the ability of Joseph to give grain. What we know of this situation when it came to Joseph is that he had a certain amount of supply of grain. He had all of this grain from the 7 years of plenty, in which the Torah says that he had so much that he stopped actually counting it. And then over the 7 years of famine, as people would come, he needed to be able to hand it out. And so what's interesting about the term mashbir with the root shin bet resh is that the root of the word actually means to divide. That is to say that he would divide out a certain portion to each individual. That buying and selling actually has embedded within it the sense that what you buy and sell is limited. There's not going to be an endless supply of what it is that you want to buy and of what you have to sell. And you have to be very smart in terms of how much you give to each individual, which is why throughout the course of this entire Torah portion, the word shever is both in mashbir in terms of selling the grain, and also regard to shever lachem, the rations of Egypt, that this word appears very often to remind us that every single time that someone is able to partake of the grain that is available in Egypt, that they have to divide it so that everyone can get, or at least anyone that can pay. Why is this so critical? And I think it has to do with the fact that the term shever has a number of different connotations in Hebrew, both with its inherent root of shin bet resh, and also of its analogous root of sin bet resh. Shin and sin are the same letters, just with two different dots, one on one side, one on the other side, and that as the same letter, they connote that they have similar meanings, even though because of that difference in where the dot is, it may actually mean something else. So first, I want to turn to another example of how the term shever is used, which should actually resonate because it deals with our story of Joseph and the selling of the food in Egypt. And so we turn now back to Sefaria.org, and we turn to Psalm 105, verse 16. Vayikra Ra'av al haaretz, and he called a famine upon the entire land. This is seemingly God making a famine appear upon the entire land. Kol mateh lechem shavar. He broke the whole staff of bread. Now, as we read further on, if you want to, you can read further on verses 16 all the way through approximately all the way through verse 23, and you have a recap of the story of Joseph. But the term shavar here, in terms of lechem shavar, is fascinating because as opposed to focusing on the fact that this is sort of, you have grain, you have bread, and it's being divided, that in the midst of the verse in which there is a famine in the land, and as a result of this famine, all bread was shavar, meaning all bread was broken, or in an updated version of this translation, was totally destroyed. That is to say that the idea of what Joseph did in Egypt, of dividing all of the rations of food, has to do with the fact that there was a destruction of food. That the reason why we can't just live aplenty is because there is a limitation to what we have. And that rationing becomes harder when we know that the food that we are eating seemingly has an expiration date. That at a certain point, there is no more. And I think that this should resonate with anyone who's dealt with food hardship, whether that's for themselves personally, through some own personal crises, or for those who go into underprivileged communities, both in America and around the world, that when you don't know where your next meal is going to come from, you're very careful when you actually receive a meal, when you actually have some food with you, and you have to be very careful in terms of how you divide it, because the amount that you divide is dependent upon the feeling that you're going to be able to get it again. And if you know, or if you have a sense that that food has been destroyed, then you're going to hold on to what you have in a much more precious way. And that's the very difficult aspect of rationing, that it reminds us of the fact that we no longer will have what we are currently having at that moment. But there's another aspect to rationing that is maybe a little bit more hopeful. And that has to do with the understanding of shavar, with the sin, so of sin bet resh, as appears in a number of different sources in the book of Psalms especially, but there is one famous place in which that root is used. It appears in what is often recited in synagogues as a prayer known as the Ashrei, which is a combination of a couple different psalms, mostly Psalm 145. And that is the psalm that we're going to turn to. Some of you may be aware of this line already. And so we turn now to safari.org one more time. And here it is, verse 15. Einei chol elecha yisaberu, ve'ata noten lahem et ochlam be'ito. The eyes of all wait for you. Ve'ata noten lahem et ochlam be'ito. And you give them their food in their due season. Einei chol elecha yisaberu. The eyes all look towards you, and they wait. They wait for you. What's fascinating about this line, by the way, is if you look at the next line, it's that idea of waiting for the food that God's going to give them leads to one of the most famous lines in the entire Ashrei, that after it is that you wait for him, after you wait for God, then God is going to open up God's hand and to satisfy everything for the people. And I think it's interesting to note that the words yisaberu with the root sin bet resh looks uncannily similar to the root sin bet ayin. And sin bet ayin means to satisfy. So yisaberu, that sense of hope amidst the that when we wait for God, or another translation is that when we hope, we place our hope in God, that we will be able to have God fulfill our desires. That, I think, is a very powerful understanding of this kind of rationing that happened in Egypt, and also to help us understand what it means to ration. that when Joseph was rationing out all of this food to give to Egypt and to all the other nations, and he was dividing it based upon how long he knew he had, given the fact that a lot of the food was destroyed at that time, that the only reason he was able to actually have any food to give, the only reason why Egypt was the place in which there was food for all the nations to come, was because Joseph was able to interpret Pharaoh's dream and to understand that this was what God had intended. And not only is it that it's not just that Joseph interpreted God's dream, Pharaoh's dream, but it's that Joseph said to Pharaoh, it's not I who interpret, it's God who interprets. And Pharaoh responded at the end saying, I'm going to put you in charge, Joseph, because I know that God is with you. In other words, that there is a sense of faith embedded within what Joseph actually did. It wasn't just that he was good at being able to divide food, but it's that he had a connection with God that saw this kind of feast and then famine as an opportunity. And that, I think, is the key for us to take away. That is to say, when we come into a moment in which we know that there is a resource, we believe that there is a resource which has an expiration date, or that we fear that there could potentially be an expiration date, but we don't know for sure, that perhaps when we think about what it is that we are doing, we could think of it either in one of two ways. We could think of it as sharing our resources or using those resources in a divided way because we fear the end, because we fear the fact that there is going to be a time in which this resource is here no longer. Or we divide them at certain times. We ration out how much we need in order to remind us that it is not simply upon us whether those resources are going to be here, but rather that there is something more ultimate at work, that there is a greater power at work, and that our faith is embedded in our ability to respond to the realities that we face. We still have to deal with the reality. We still have to deal with the potential of destruction. But we can approach it with the mindset that our rations right now are what we need in our due time. That as the prayer says, that food is going to be given to us in our due time. So for now, they may need to be rationed. Maybe in the future, we won't have to worry about it. But when we are in the midst of that rationing, it gives us hope of a better future than in focusing upon the possibility that those resources are no longer here. And so my hope and my prayer is that as we face situations when it deals with a limited number of resources, whether it is with food, with money, with natural resources, with time, with anything that we may potentially have or need to receive, that we go about it with a sense that we have, that every little ration that we take is filled with the hope that what we are having at this time, what we are consuming at that moment, is all that we need at that time. And when we potentially run out, that there will be more of that or of something else for which we can then consume. That our resources will continue to be there as long as we act responsibly to divide at the right time. That's what Joseph did. Joseph divided according to what was necessary at his time, with the hope that at the end of that time, that he was going to really be able to have what he needed. And so my hope is that our resources will always continue to be there, in their due time. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this week's class. Take care, have a Shabbat Shalom, and see you next week. All the best. Bye-bye.